Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us in this transformative and educational conversation today. Rotten Tomatoes and the NLGJA-LA and Philadelphia chapters are so honored to have these journalists, thought leaders, organizers, and creatives joining us today. Thank you so much to our panelists. At the end of the conversation, we will have a Q&A, so please drop your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll get to them after the panel. I'm nervous because all of y'all are people whose work I followed for so many years, and I'm like, wow, this is happening. It's real. My name is Sophie. My pronouns are they, them, or she, her, and I manage the critics community at Rotten Tomatoes. I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists, and then we will get started. Joining us today, we have award-winning journalist, podcast host, and authoress, Tre'vell Anderson. We have radio and podcast editor and senior producer at TransLash Media, Oliver Ash Kleine. We have award-winning producer and director of Transgender Representation at GLAAD, Alex Schmider. We have bilingual Latinx journalist, filmmaker, and programmer, Kristal Sotomayor. And we have award-winning author, activist, media strategist, and as of this week, published memoirist, Raquel Willis. Thank you so much to the five of you. The title of our conversation today, The Visibility Dilemma, is in recognition of the double-edged sword of visibility for trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks. As with all things, visibility is complex. It informs and is informed by our personal experiences and our shared experiences. Some of us have the choice to be visible. For some of us, it's an imperative or something that is thrust upon us. And for others, it's not a choice or an option at all. Visibility prompts questions about safety and community, about who is perceiving us, who holds power, who tells our stories, and why. At the same time as visibility allows us to see each other and allows other generations to understand our history and imagine what's possible for our futures, visibility in a hostile environment carries risks. There are not just personal risks involved in being one individual visible trans person. There are collective threats, patterns, and statistical increases in violent and legislative attacks on our community. These risks are not natural parts of being trans, but the result of systems like racism, transphobia, homophobia, sexism, and classism that endanger all of us. There are many lenses through which we can talk about visibility, but we're going to just discuss a few of them today. I want to kick off our conversation by asking everyone, from each of your personal and professional experiences, what does the word visibility mean right now in 2023? Raquel, we'll start with you.
Wow. Okay. Just starting with the heavy ones. Well, thank you for having me here. I think it's so important for us to unpack visibility, what it means, what it has meant, and kind of how that has changed for the community. When I think about visibility, of course, I think about how there was a time period that was kind of packaged as our visibility era, right? And I'm sure we'll talk more about that throughout the conversation. And in this time, of course, we saw the rise of people in Hollywood of trans experience. So folks like Laverne Cox and on and on. And then, of course, we saw other figures like Janet Mock and, for better or worse, Caitlyn Jenner. I'm going to shade her whenever I can. So don't test me on that one. But, I think about that visibility era and what it meant for trans people to be more legible in some ways, at least in media, and maybe there started to be more nuance around our discussions. But of course, visibility isn't inherently benevolent. It isn't just, this kind of filter on our lives that means that everything has changed for the better. And so when I think about visibility in 2023, I'm often thinking about how that hasn't always been in lockstep with the vitality of our community. When I think about Black trans folks, for instance, I'm thinking about the 1 in 4 Black trans and non-binary youth who report suicidal ideation. within the past year. I think of the 2/3 of Black trans women who are living and thriving mostly on their own accord with HIV. And of course, the 52% of victims this year who were Black trans women, when we're talking about these national rates of anti-trans violence. So the visibility piece is important, and the work we do in media is important, but we have to have a lens that, again, elevates the vitality and is connected to changing those material realities. And maybe later on, we'll have a discussion about what that looks like.
I'll jump in just to say, I think what Raquel said is so important about the difference between visibility and vitality. And by the way, thank you all for having us, for hosting this conversation. And I think from the perspective of GLAAD and myself as an independent film producer, I'm always thinking about the delineation between visibility and actual personal familiarity. There's this horrifying and hilarious statistic that more people believe they've seen a ghost than met a transgender person. And while I know that that reporting is because many people are not aware they've met or know a trans person, it remains, I think, an important benchmark for how we discuss issues of visibility. So yes, we've never been more visible as a community because of the political and cultural discourse, but that visibility is not necessarily defined by how authentic it is or accurate about who we are, what our stories are, and the complexity of our lives as people, rather than through the lens of issues. So I think that visibility can sometimes feel symbolic, like, sure, now people know trans people exist, even though we've always existed throughout culture and history. And now with that awareness and visibility, there are some who are doing everything in their power to legislate against our basic humanity and affect us with violence in our everyday lives, specifically trans women of color, as Raquel cited, that horrifying statistic of the epidemic of violence. But I think importantly to question invisibility is not only in quantity, like how many stories are reporting on us, but who is reporting those stories? How are those stories being framed? And really digging into the balance and imbalance of what that visibility looks like. And I'll have more to share later, but just wanted to like really set, the people that don't know us, they think they don't know us. And so every bit of information and education they're getting is from the stories that are being told in mainstream media, and really questioning where those are coming from and from who.
I just, throw out into the mix. When I think about visibility in this moment, I think of exhaustion of the work it is to be visible. This is was it Trans Awareness Week, Trans Visibility Week? I don't know which one. They got all these different names for the weeks. But this is one of them. And I'm sure Raquel feels this. I know Alex feels this. I'm sure Kristal and Oliver Ash feel this, right? Being visible, even just on our levels, and I think we all represent a variety of different levels of visibility, right, in the community. We can all be doing what we're doing for the greater good, for what it will mean for those who come after us, those who came before us. But it is very tiring to be visible. At least I'm tired. Maybe y'all still got the energy. I'm not sure. But I am, just take a little vacation. And so that's what I think about. And I introduced that into this conversation because I think, even as we applaud the, immense increased, unprecedented visibility, right, that the community is experiencing, that we are all participating in so many different ways. As Alex and Raquel have already said, the material realities of the community haven't actually shifted alongside that visibility. right? And even for many of us who are in the public eye doing this visibility work, we make it look good, we make it look easy, right? But it is difficult to place ourselves in many of these spaces. And so that's what I'm thinking about when it relates to visibility in this particular moment.
I'll go next. Tre'vell, yeah, I super hear the exhaustion, the tiredness, and feel that deeply. I think when I think about visibility, I often think of it on a spectrum of things that we're kind of navigating around, assimilation, surviving, progress versus liberation and embodiment. And I think that, it brings up for me that there's just challenges and contradictions around like authenticity and power that inform like what visibility looks like. And I think it has like the potential to be like visibility has the potential to be really transformative. It has the potential to show us better futures, what we can be, what the world can be. Which I think speaks to, what Raquel was saying about the vitality of community. But, it's also, we're in a system that is often limiting and stifling and limits what visibility can look like. And so, when I think about visibility, I think a lot about those contradictions.
Yeah, and for me, being like non-binary Latinx, thinking about visibility kind of on a like non-US scale, I think about the colonialism in Latin America and the Spanish language that's highly gendered, and there's absolutely like no way to talk about like non-binary folks. There's no way to even talk about like your lived experiences without saying la mesa. Why does the table have to be feminine? Why can I not like express my own beliefs and my own like sense of self in a like gender neutral way? And there's been a lot of, I'm sure as you all know, backlash around like Latinx, Latina with an E, from people of all age ranges. I've literally heard like people my own age say like, well, why would we do Latinx if my grandparents aren't going to understand it? But you're the person arguing against it and you're my age. So, and I also think about like recently Mexico's first like non-binary magistrate was murdered. And his name is Jesus Ociel Baena. And so I want to bring him into this conversation as we talk about like the people that have, been visible and like allow us to be here, and to pay homage to them as well.
Thank you, all of you. I want to talk a little bit about Tre'vell's beautiful book that was published earlier this year. Congratulations, your first of two. I want to talk about We See Each Other, a Black trans journey through film and television. I want to ask you, in the context of visibility, what does it mean for queer folks and trans folks to see ourselves in popular culture? And if you'd like to, also, what does it mean for other folks to perceive us as trans and non-binary through the lens of those narratives?
Yeah, so Alex invoked, one of the cornerstone GLAAD statistics about the visibility of the community, and how, more people say they've seen a ghost than they've, met a trans person. I think it's like 70% of people believe they've never met a trans person. And so GLAAD lovingly reminds us that because of that, right, the media that we are consuming, right, becomes all that much more important, because John Q. Public is learning about trans people via that, and we as trans people, right, are also learning about what they think of us, right, through that as well. And I think, for me, when I'm thinking about just like visibility, representations of our community on screen. I think a lot of it traces back to, if you've seen Disclosure, you know a little bit about this, right? It traces back to the, earliest images of gender nonconformity on screen being cross-dressed characters, right? Men dressed up as women, from the earliest moving images in the silent era to Tyler Perry in Medea, as Medea, right? There's a long journey and history. Robin Williams as Mrs. Doubtfire goes into that. Some Like It Hot is in there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I often highlight those characters, though those characters are not trans characters, to be clear, but I highlight them because we live in a world ultimately where, the folks who, hate us, and the folks who say they don't know us or say they have not met us, right? They believe that, trans women in films are nothing but men in wigs. And so therefore their thoughts and their feelings about what they've consumed, seeing men in wigs, these cross-dressed characters since the beginning of moving images, right, manifests in terms of the violence that we as a community experience in everyday life. And so it becomes important for me to discuss the particular intersections and issues around those images, bringing into the conversation, right, the importance of trans people playing trans characters, right, on screen, and how that contributes to a shift, we hope, in how people see us in culture writ large. But it all goes back to this idea of the images that people are consuming. And with that GLAAD statistic, I take it a step further and I say the reason why people believe they've never met a trans person, right, is because they have not made the environment around them safe enough for the trans people who are already there to tell folks who they are. Right. And so now how can we begin to think about the content that we are consuming and creating, whether it's movies, TV, journalistic articles, podcasts, art displays, music, etc., as making the environments around us safer for the trans people who are already there, right, to be able to openly claim those particular identities. I don't know if I answered your question, Sophie, but hopefully I did.
Yes, beautifully. Thank you. I want to ask all five of you if there are people from history, not fictional characters, but real people from our current culture or our past that are trans or queer that you wish you had learned about sooner or that you wish everyone knew about. Kristal, I know you have someone you want to share. Let's start with you.
Yeah, so I made this like short documentary called Don't Cry for Me, All You Drag Queens, about this like legendary queen from New Hope, Pennsylvania, called Mother Cavallucci. And she was pretty much like cross-dressing in like the 40s and 50s, being like openly gay and like cross-dressing in the military at a time when it was straight up illegal. And there's also been like a lot of kind of questions about, her personal gender identity, like what was she really relating to? Because there wasn't really the language. She was older, but one of her daughters was like an amazing, beautiful, like trans Puerto Rican woman. And, I always just think about Mother Cavallucci, everything that she gave to New Hope, Pennsylvania. She was like one of the main people like fundraising in the community, coming out to help people. And, she was accepted in her community all the way to like being non-binary Latinx and thinking like, oh, I'm going to go to like a Catholic church and I'm going to be accepted is kind of crazy. But she would go like full bouffant and dress and like heels and everything. And the priest was like, how are you? Like, it was like nothing, and even like when she was buried, the priest called her Josie instead of like, her masculine name. And so for me, like she is like the trans icon and like the non-binary icon that never really like got a chance to really understand and explore what that could mean for them, given like the time period that they were living in. And like not having any like family support, having to build like a chosen family, creating like all of these different pathways for a community that would have like never been there. And she really like changed things a lot in New Hope. Like it's a very queer friendly place because of a lot of the work that she did. And so for me, she's like one of like my non-binary icons, like gender expansive icons, along with like Walter Mercado, like people who like unfortunately because of where they were and how old that they weren't able to like explore or be open about who they were. So yeah, that for me is, she's my ancestor.
I'll throw somebody out. I've talked too much already, but I love telling people about Lucy Hicks Anderson, who I like to say was my cousin. And Lucy Hicks Anderson was, you know, a bad bitch in the late 1800s, early 1900s, okay? She was a trans woman who owned a brothel, and so she was a madam. And she was also, you know, a really great chef. And the way that she is entered into the public record is because a sailor partook in the services of her brothel and, you know, got a little itchy scratchy. And so then the police made all of the women at the brothel go through a medical examination, including Lucy Hicks Anderson. And that's how, you know, she is entered into the public record as one of the, you know, earliest documented experiences of a Black trans person in this country. But she was also a really great chef and sort of a socialite of sorts. There was a story of her being, you know, detained, and this really, you know, big banker in the community, he had hired her to cater his an event, that party that he was putting on, and so he bailed her out so that she could, you know, cook for him, which I think is just really interesting. So she's somebody who I love, you know, telling people of, especially because everybody feels like, you know, we dropped onto the face of the earth with Laverne Cox in Orange is the New Black. And so to assert, right, that someone like Lucy Hicks Anderson, you know, lived in the 1800s, affirmed by her parents, right, when she was 15 years old, in so many ways, I think is important history for us to know.
Alex, I can't. Well, I think on a similar tip, as Tre'vell, I think about Black transcestors from like particularly the 1800s and the many more that we have not, you know, uncovered the stories of. So I think of someone like Frances Thompson, right, who had an overlapping lifetime with Lucy Hicks Anderson. She was an enslaved trans woman in the mid 1800s from Alabama. She was in slavery there. But she also was someone who fled during the Memphis riots in 1866. And I think what's so interesting about her story is just, as a Black trans person, not only do we deal with not being seen, I think, by general society, but I think even within Black community, there's this idea that queerness and transness is some kind of white phenomenon that we just kind of latched onto if we met other folks in community or went off to college somewhere, and it's like, no, honey, we've always been here. So I think about someone like her who inserts Black gender nonconformity into the discussion of Black history in the United States and the era of enslavement. And she is also someone who experienced sexual assault and testified at Congress. So this idea of a kind of proto-Me Too era of her saying, no, this isn't okay, the violation of my body isn't okay, I think is so important and touching. So yeah, so I would say her. But honestly, thinking about growing up in the 90s and 2000s, I needed any figure. who was trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming, because we really didn't have many. All I had was RuPaul, and child, that's a whole nother story. Shout out to Ru, Mama Ru, but I needed so much more as a young person, and I think that's why our work is so important now.
That's actually, I'm so glad you went first, Raquel, but it's always hard to follow you. I was going to say our history is so underdocumented because trans people, again, as I said before, have existed across cultures and through time. And because of white Western colonialism, often we don't know about those cultures. We don't know about those traditions. We don't hear those stories. And as Chase Joint's film Framing Agnes points to, is there is an absence in that historical record of the people who existed, and that often tells us more about the culture that they lived than those people themselves. And we try to assign meaning and or symbolism to their existence in a way that may not be true to who they are, or allow them to exist in the complexity that they did. So to Raquel's point, when I was growing up in Orange County, California, a gender nonconforming young person, the only out student in my high school, looking around for anyone who could show me that I belonged in the world, there was nothing except for the film Boys Don't Cry, which, if you know the film, it does not provide a much hopeful outlook on what life looks like as a transgender man. And so that reinforces my work at GLAAD, my work as a filmmaker, to look at the absence, to look at the imbalance, both in the media that we ingest and consume and in the media we create, and in looking around at who else is around us. I'm in many ways grateful for the proliferation of social media so that more and more people can share their truths and stories, because that didn't really exist when I was coming into myself. And I think it's so beneficial to be able to see diversity of people and be like, even if that person is not the same as me, I can see parts of myself in the constellation of who they are, and maybe form who I am in the many images. And it speaks to the necessity of mainstream media to reflect that diversity, so that we can see more and understand more of those stories that are all around us all the time. And I think as a culture, we need to recognize the value in those many kinds of stories that may not look traditional in the sense that history has documented.
Yeah, I want to echo that a little bit, or kind of build onto that. I feel very disconnected from like history in a lot of ways, and feel like a lot of it is hidden in, because my work day to day is often looking at the disinformation and the horror that we are facing today. That my capacity to delve back is sometimes limited, and so, but that's something that I feel like I want to do more of, and because I feel like it, you see so many more examples of what life can be like, and how what people have, lived before. And I think another thing that I've gotten really interested in moving towards is seeing representations that aren't lifted up or seen by like the mainstream media. So just like zines at like art fairs by trans people and things like that, that are just have very different perspectives than what we're getting day to day and kind of the mass media environment.
Thank you all.
Can I really quick? I mean, I think on this point of history, I mean, there are so many powerful folks moving, our expansion of understanding trans history. And so a lot of the conversations we have right now, we can't have without people like Susan Stryker, without folks like C. Riley Snorton, without folks like Julia Serrano, and more. So I just wanted to, and Monica Roberts, the late, great Monica Roberts, so I just want to give some shout outs to our OGs and folks who are moving that historical aspect of our lives.
I'm so glad you said that, Raquel. Monica Roberts, I mean, all of our community needs to know who she was and what she did. And I think it speaks to something that our history is being written now. And all of the people that are doing this work, whether or not they're covered in the media in the way that they deserve and are dignified to be, there are so many people doing this work and deserving of that recognition of driving us forward. And often they don't do it for the attention or the credit. They're doing it for the benefit of the movement. And so I would also encourage us to look beyond social followers, to look beyond public posting often, and really interrogate like what that work looks like for our collective liberation. And Monica Roberts is someone that, again, everyone needs to know. And I would also say my boss at GLAAD, Nick Adams, who has been at GLAAD for 25 years, he's a trans man himself, is responsible for, I would say, I mean, Tre'vell, you checked me on this, but like 92, 93, maybe higher of the good trans representation we've seen in TV and film. He doesn't do this work for the accolades or the credit or the attention. He does it because he knows that media moves our culture forward. And so, again, looking behind the scenes of those people who've been in the work, been doing the work, and are about the work, is something that I think we should put value on as well, whether or not they're as visible as others.
Thank you for that. I think that really speaks to the point about who is holding the mic when our stories are told, whether we're telling our personal experiences or amplifying the stories of other folks in our community. For me, watching Disclosure, the documentary that you mentioned earlier, Tre'vell, which some of you appeared on or worked in, was really transformative in how I understand not just our history, but how our stories can be told when trans folks are on and off the camera. To quote GLAAD Media again, GLAAD Media and other reports indicate that when lesbian, gay, and bi activists were advocating for marriage equality, visible representation was important in moving the needle. But as we all know, that's not always the case for everyone. Visibility often coincides with increased legislative and violent attacks on our community. I want to acknowledge that this year on Trans Remembrance Day, we will be honoring the lives of more than 300 trans folks who have been murdered this year. To your point earlier, Raquel, more than half of those folks are Black trans femmes. There are also, as of this week, 376 active anti-trans bills in the United States, according to the Trans Legislation Tracker. These include bans on gender-affirming care, bans on kids playing sports that match their gender identities, and bathroom bans. I want to ask each of you how this dilemma of visibility shows up in your work. Alex, I want to start with you because you are director of transgender representation at GLAAD and you were a producer on Disclosure. So how does the dilemma of visibility show up in your work?
Oof, what a loaded question. That dilemma is ever present in my work at GLAAD and as an independent film producer. I think where I'm always trying to situate representation is in its balance. So speaking again to what I've sort of been harping on over and over is which stories of us are overrepresented, which stories about us are underrepresented, where is the scale tipped and whose finger is on it. I think it's why we talk so much at GLAAD, not only about representation on screen, which is that visibility that people see, but also the representation of who is telling those stories behind the scenes and driving the authenticity of what those stories look like. Because I think part of what we've been speaking to in this visibility conversation is that we are experiencing that hyper visibility, which trans femme people of color have mostly always been at the center of because of the media and culture's sensationalism of that community. We need to see those people responsible and empowered to be telling those stories, because otherwise it continues to reinforce the social scripts that we've seen in the past. Like if you've watched Disclosure, you just see concentrated narratives of transphobia over and over and over again. And especially when that's done by protagonists that you're supposed to root for or model yourself after, those are social scripts that are then directly applied to how people behave and act and react to trans people in their real lives. So where this is central in the work that I do, again, both at GLAAD and as an independent producer, is looking at understanding the context of one individual story that does not exist on its own. It exists in a context. It exists in a collection that has come before it, that exists now, and looking at what the consequences of that representation are on the people being portrayed. I can speak more about the stereotypes that we're constantly combating in our work at GLAAD when we're reviewing scripts and providing recommendations of different producers and writers to come into that storytelling fold. But I think the more that we are hearing about our stories from first person perspectives and not framed within an issue lens, the better we will be, because trans people need to be humanized in a way that for the better part of Hollywood's telling of our stories, we haven't been. And I would really also be interested in hearing from those who are journalists on this panel about that in the journalist news reporting space, because I can talk all I want about Hollywood and entertainment, but increasingly I think the overlap between Hollywood and entertainment, journalism and news are meeting, and that's where we need to focus all of our efforts on pushing back on what that instinct and impulse is to recreate and replicate that Hollywood reaction of the past of how to tell our stories.
That's a perfect transition. I would really love to highlight Oliver's work. You are a producer on the Anti-Trans Hate Machine, Oliver. I'd love to ask you and the rest of our panel, if any of you are interested as well, what is a myth about transness that is common in your work, and what is the truth behind it?
Yeah, I think that the last season of the Anti-Trans Hate Machine, we investigated some of the disinformation framing, the instances to try to get rid of medical care for trans youth and where those come from. And and how they've infiltrated even centrist and progressive spaces. It culminated in an investigation into the disinformation that the New York Times is spreading about trans youth. And I think that one of the biggest give me a second, I'm so sorry. It's so endemic in our culture, all of this disinformation, and it's not just about trans people. It's widespread throughout the media industry on so many different intersecting issues that it's almost like so overwhelming to pinpoint one thing, and there's so much disinformation about trans people. And I think that from a media perspective, one of the things that I really struggle with is seeing how deep it is, seeing how pervasive it is, and how much worse it's gotten over the last couple of years. And so, but going back to the disinformation about trans youth in particular, I mean, that's all based on pseudoscience. That's like a right-wing Christian nationalist campaign, and it all, when you get down to it, it sounds like such a conspiracy theory, but it's reality. And so it's sometimes hard to get people to buy in, especially folks who are, oh, we're just asking questions, we're just and so a lot of our work is around untangling that.
And I just want to applaud that work really quickly and say too, the thing that I appreciate about what TransLash does and what so many of the journalists on this call do is really getting to the root of where this is coming from. This anti-trans backlash is a well-funded, well-coordinated effort by people who saw the progress of the LGBTQ community and said, and they did research on what would be most effective to push this community back. And it was to capitalize on the personal unfamiliarity of the populace on trans people and exploit that unfamiliarity into fear, into concern trolling, into protect the children, like all of these messages that we've heard from the 70s and 80s and before that are just repurposed and repackaged in order to scapegoat a community that, because many people don't know us personally or think they don't, it's able to be effective unless we are inserting and intervening those personal stories of like, actually, we're good if you would just let us be and let us safely and freely live our lives as who we are. So sorry, Raquel, I saw you unmute.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think the biggest myth that I encounter, and I think pretty much all of us encounter, is that we don't exist, or that trans people, non-binary folks, gender non-conforming folks, queer folks are invalid in some way. And so I think that that leads us into these ideas of being dehumanized, these ideas that we don't deserve to be protected, these ideas that we aren't desirable or beautiful or lovable, and on and on. And so, you know, I think that that's kind of the baseline myth out there. And I also want to salute all the work that folks like Oliver Ash and Amar Jones and so many others at TransLash are doing to uncover, as you were saying, Alex, that this isn't this hate that we're experiencing, this mountain of misinformation that we're up against. It didn't just appear out of nowhere, right? Like it's been constructed and it's being facilitated and fielded. And when I think about how visibility comes up in my work, I think about those gaps, as you were saying, Alex. I mean, in the work that I do with GLAAD, particularly around newsroom accountability, honey, we have this idea that just because somebody is a journalist and they are an expert in one issue, that they're an expert in all the issues. And I'm okay to be the first one to say that a lot of our news industry simply does not have the fucking range to discuss the complexity of identity and the complexity of gender and on and on. And we have to be willing to name that. I know I dropped an F-bomb, but the FCC is not coming after us on this platform, so we're good. But I think about that. I also just think about the endless kind of one-on-one conversations that folks like me and Barbara over at GLAAD and Angela and so many others have, that just kind of show the lack of understanding the experiences of folks on the margins across the board in our news industry. And so it's not just happening to trans folks, right? It happens to Black folks and other communities of color. It happens to immigrants. It happens to, of course, right now, we see it happening to Palestinian folks, right? And Muslim folks as well. And then, of course, the weaponizing of trauma and harm of groups like Jewish folks and so many others. So it's so important for us to understand that we can't just be having conversations about DEI and, expanding narratives in other industries. No, it has to happen in the newsroom industry as well. And I think the other thing that I just want to name is that one of the biggest kind of problems, or maybe the Achilles heel of our industry, is this kind of warped idea of what objectivity is and what it means. We have this myth, which isn't necessarily a trans myth, that to be a journalist or to be a storyteller, that is worth snuff, I guess, to bring in a Southern, saying. It's this idea that you have to be unbiased. And it's a fallacy that anyone can be perfectly unbiased. And actually, if we are not actively discussing how systems of oppression are all tied up in the news industry, we are feeding into the bias that already exists. This hegemonic idea that white supremacy is okay, that the cis heteropatriarchy is okay, and that folks who have systemically and historically not had the power and the platform to tell their stories on their own terms don't know what the hell they're talking about. So that is a myth that I hope that we can continue to chip away at. And I know everyone on this call is invested in that.
I'm so grateful that you brought that up, Raquel. As a person who went to journalism school, our reporting education was often framed around you go into a situation curious and your ignorance will be informed by the answers that you get. And I deeply, deeply wonder how different reporting would be generally on our community, but also generally if people were encouraged to go in informed and then be aware that their assumptions will be challenged by the people who have those lived experiences. How different would the factual reporting be? How different would the biases be? And how many fewer myths we would have? Did anyone else want to comment on that question? Yeah.
I want to comment on that. And I want to talk about labor and the visibility of the people doing the labor as well, because like, so I'm a programmer, I used to work in awards, and if like I wasn't in the room, like queerness, trans folks, Latinidad, nobody cared. Like there were like, those films did not rise to the top. Nobody would do a second watch. Like, you know, I really had to push for certain stories, for certain filmmakers, for certain perspectives. And the same thing is true in journalism and in filmmaking. And so I just want to say it's so important to have labor protections. As a worker in particular, we see like there's so many abuses in these industries. It's like low wages, and yet you're required to go to LA and to, you know, commute into work every day. So it's very, very important for folks to really consider like unions as a really great protection, especially for queer folks. Like there's no federal protections, anti-discrimination protections for queer and trans folks, but like you can have in your union contract, there will be absolutely no discrimination against gender, against transitioning. Actually, you can advocate for having health insurance that will allow like gender affirming care. You can institute policies around the importance of pronoun usage. And if you're being misgendered, you know, there's a grievance right there towards your employer. So really, I just want to advocate so much for the folks doing this labor to highly consider like unionizing to protect yourself, and especially like the things that are important to allow the queer and trans stories to be like visible, and to be visible like in a way that is actually accurate, but that will protect you as the labor doing that work too.
I want to just like double tap. I think that's double click, double thumbs up, whatever on what Kristal just said. Because I think there's also, in addition, and going from that, what I often see in the entertainment industry that's related to this conversation around journalism and newsrooms is that if a film or a project or a company is working on a trans initiative, they will just find the closest person to them and assume that that person wants to take on that labor, is equipped to do that labor, and is being supported to succeed in doing that labor. And I think this comes up a lot in Hollywood and entertainment of, because someone has an identity, there's an assumption that they will be expert in what they're then being asked to do. And I think it's really important for all of us to always be questioning, like, am I the right person to be doing this work? Or is there someone that is more competent, more expert that I can recommend and or suggest? I always use the joke, I'm never going to hire a veterinarian to do a dentist's job. I am a storyteller. I'm an advocate. I work at GLAAD. If someone wants to know about legislation and policy, I'm not the guy. I'm probably going to direct you to Raquel or Oliver Ash Kleine, or probably not Tre'vell. If you have questions about culture, entertainment, I'm telling you to go get Tre'vell's opinion on that. But I think it's really important to identify that everyone on this panel, everyone in our community, we have our own lived identities and experiences, and we have our own skill sets and expertise and backgrounds that many of us have been trained in and are experienced in. And I want to move beyond that tokenism just because someone is of a community does not necessarily mean that specific opportunities or for them or not, if it's not a perfect fit for how they're going to be supported and succeed in those roles.
And looping around to what a little bit about Raquel was saying around objectivity and what Kristal was saying about unions, if you actually look at the history of objectivity in journalism, it came about from union busting. Lewis Wallace wrote a great book about it called The View from Somewhere. And historically, like from the foundations, journalism wasn't objective. And if you look at the most critical journalism throughout our history, it's not objective. There's an agenda. It's calling out systems that are broken. It's calling out things that are bad. And when we talk about objectivity in journalism, like what that often is just reiterating what people in power are saying and what their interests are, and isn't helpful for our broader society a lot of the time.
I often feel like the people who do the best journalistic work are those who are oriented around justice, because you want to correct some kind of mainstream narrative. I think we may have lost Raquel. Hopefully she will be back. I do want to ask her about her memoir, but let's start by asking each of you, what is a defining principle of your work? What motivates you, and how do you put your principle into practice? Kristal, can we start with you? Oh, my dear, you are muted.
Okay, a motivating principle in my work, I would say, is just like thinking about things from a standpoint of liberation and of like labor justice. So talk to me if you want to talk about unions and unionizing your workspace. Let's make things better for everyone. If we're going to live in a capitalistic society, you better get that money. You better get like benefits. You better get that vacation time. So yes, that would be my response.
I'll go. I think a defining principle of my work is very much so related to the conversation that was just happening around, newsrooms and journalism. I think that we always say that like journalism is like the first draft of history or whatever, that corny thing they used to tell us. But if we are going to assume that that is correct, then it requires us as journalists to be, documenting the lived experiences of humanity in as vast ways as possible, and making sure that we are, doing an accurate reflection of what life looks like today, not just parroting, the positions and experiences and feelings and thoughts of those who are already in power. And so I think that shows up in my work by just kind of rejecting, as a film reporter, that which is considered canon, and encouraging us to reconsider, right, the images that we find to be and deem to be the most influential and the most impactful in our society and culture, taking a critical eye at those things, and ultimately challenging, right, what is this, foundational principle in our industry of objectivity. I always say that objectivity is not only a machination of white supremacy, but it is just subjectivity from the position of those who are already in power, right? But the work becomes difficult because so much of our work, right, as the folks who are on this call, we've already invoked the name of Amara Jones and Monica Roberts, etc., is that work deeply unsettles the foundation, right, of this industry, right, in the same ways that, the work of Ida B. Wells, for example, right, unsettled the foundation of, journalism industry, and her documentation of the lynchings of Black people, largely Black men. And so it requires, I think, us to always, it always seems as if we are in this kind of antagonistic position with a lot of the, you know, more legacy oriented media entities. But it is incumbent upon all of us, I believe, to just try to introduce a little bit more nuance, a little bit more detail, a little bit more context, right, into the work that we are doing, because it all informs, right, what our lived experience looks like today, and will inform those who come after us and stumble upon or seek out the work that we are creating today.
I will go because I don't want to follow Raquel and her talking about the risk it takes to bloom. What informs and is consistent throughout my work is, as Tre'vell was mentioning, a consideration for the context. No one story, no one project, no one statement or idea exists in a vacuum, and it has impact and influence on everyone around. And so often in my work at GLAAD, I am removing myself from how I am interpreting a project. I'm instead looking from a data-informed perspective, like how many stories have we actually seen of trans people being loved? Raquel and I have a lot of conversations about that is such a radical and needed story that shouldn't be radical and shouldn't be needed. It should be abundant. I strongly believe that those stories of us being loved are underrepresentative of the actual lived reality that many of us are in. And part of that, both in my work at GLAAD and outside in all of my independent filmmaking, I try to invoke what Rain Valdez, a brilliant actress and producer, says, that love is propaganda for who gets to be loved. So if we've not seen each other being desired, being wanted, whether that's platonic, romantic, self, or other, then how can we recreate that paradigm and framework in our lives? Because these stories are scripts, they're models for us. And so in all of my work, it both accounts for the cultural context, how a singular story is not independent from the many that exist and arrives on top of a history and hopefully into a future. But also in looking at the ways we haven't been portrayed and seen ourselves, which I truly believe, again, is underrepresented and will be part of what allows us to move forward in seeing the actual reality of our lives reflected back to us, and reflected not only to us, but the people around us, to give them cues on how and what we deserve to live and be as. And so my projects will always, I'm giving away the ending to all of my films that I ever work on. They will never leave you without a sense of hope, because that is how I, as a Jewish trans man who works at GLAAD every single day, I can't get up and do this work if I don't have hope. And so that's what I want to provide for anyone that is coming into any of the films that I make and the work that we do at GLAAD. So now we get to hear about the risk it takes to bloom, I hope.
Before we move on, sorry, Oliver, did you want to speak to a principle of your work?
Yeah, I think I was like, oh, that was such a good transition, but also like Raquel should have the last one on that. Last word on that. Yeah, I think that there are a lot of values that inform my work, and a lot of leadership and just brilliance from Amara Jones that has so influenced the way that I move and the way that I work. I think a lot of, obviously, like disinformation, like countering disinformation, providing perspectives that like challenge the status quo, and also thinking about like what the community needs and what's beneficial, like what stories need to be told, right? We have on the TransLash podcast, we have a trans joy segment every episode. And we, while we do delve into heavy things, we also have lighter things. And we actually had Raquel on the show recently, which was such a good interview. It was such a delight to have you on the show, and just wonderful listening back. And I think that one thing for me personally, is that I have felt so traumatized by this world that we're living in, being in the anti-trans hate every day. And one thing that has given me hope and grounded me is this idea of emergent strategies, which comes from the abolitionist movement, and the idea that we are all just one piece of a larger puzzle, and we are all just moving together. And so the responsibility is not on all of us individually, right? And like the idea that it is a white supremacist construct. And how that's not just with the work, but like with workplace culture. Like, a lot of us at TransLash like come from a news background, and there's been a lot of intention and care put into not having that urgency while still, meeting our production timeline and stuff like that, and really like taking care of the people that are doing the work and making sure. And as we do that, like that can help set an example for other organizations to do that. And, I see emergent strategies like those things kind of like changing my personal life, like, healing from our traumas and like bringing people along with us and how that replicates out. And so that's both work and personal life, and something that I've been really trying to move more with and be intentional about.
Thank you, Oliver. Raquel, we are all talking about the principles that define the work of the folks on this call. And I know from following your work and reading your memoir and listening to interviews that obviously Black trans liberation is the defining principle of your work. How do you put that into practice in everyday life? Obviously, it's the scope of many lives worth of work. But in everyday life, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll start by saying, my personal values that I kind of have uncovered with a therapist or two over the years are authenticity, vulnerability, and joy. So those are the things that kind of animate me just in my life and the things that I want to be a part of. And so I think in my work, to your point, I guess what's become the tagline for me is honoring the dignity of folks on the margins, particularly Black trans folks. But I think in the realm of storytelling, it's been about a lot of the things that you said, Alex. I mean, uncovering and shattering systems of oppression, how they impact who we trust to be storytellers and why, what stories we tell and why, and how people receive certain stories and why. So I think that is something I'm constantly kind of mulling over in my head when I think about the kind of specific projects that I work on. I want to talk about, I guess, the Trans Youth Town Hall, because with that project, there was so much intention. There was so much space, I guess, to have intention around the distribution of it. And so we were able to partner with groups like Centerlink and the GSA Network on a campaign called Scene. And we played the series in LGBTQ plus centers across the country, right? So this idea of accessibility was so important. And I think that's so much a part of the storytelling process, right? It's not just the stories that we craft, but also how we're going to get that out into the world and get to folks who may not have the coins for a streaming service subscription, right? Or may not be able to buy a ticket to, go to a movie theater and on and on. So I think that part is important. But I think it's also encouraging the everyday person to understand that they can be a storyteller. So our trans youth, our non-binary youth, our queer youth have to know that they have their story at their disposal. And, not to be cliche and pull from, Spider-Man or whatever, but, there is a great responsibility that comes with understanding the power of the story and the power of your own personal story. And you have to make a choice in whether you're going to use that story to hopefully expand the opportunities for the next person to maybe tell their own story on their own terms, or whether you're going to weaponize that story and maybe silence others, or snuff out the power of their story. We have to understand that power as individuals, and of course in the media industry. So that's what's on my heart. I don't know that gets to the specific question, but those are the things that I'm often thinking about, especially in a visible space that I think so many of us are also in.
Thank you so much. We are going to move into our Q&A now. So if folks who are listening have questions, please drop them in the Q&A function and we will answer them for you. One of the first questions in the Q&A is from a non-binary journalist and filmmaker named Jenny Kermode. This person chaired the UK's Trans Media Watch for a decade and is now working on inclusivity at the Bylines Network. And they said, I'd love to know how we can partner more effectively across the Atlantic on international stories. What are your thoughts?
That is a great question, and thank you so much for sharing it. I know that from a GLAAD perspective, we would love to connect with you and hear more about what kind of support would be helpful and needed. And also like acknowledging that in different geographic regions and based on different cultures, there are going to be nuances that are independent and unique to where you are and what you're working on. And so we can also recommend different people who are on the ground there for you to connect with and build community with to help do this work. It's really exciting to hear about what you're doing. And so I think at the end of this conversation, all of our handles and where to contact us will be there, but would love to hear more and figure out how to support you in that work. And just want to also plug that some of the best trans stories right now are coming internationally. And so the opportunity here, both for the news and entertainment, is immense. And just thank you for the work. I don't know if anyone has anything to add.
I want to underscore, Alex, what you're saying. I mean, especially for folks who live in the US and work in the US, we have to have this lens around dismantling US hegemony, and this kind of idea that the US is the utopia and the most progressive and all of that. I mean, that narrative comes up over and over again, and it erases the lives of queer, trans, and non-binary folks across the world, right? So we have to be chipping away at that every chance that we get. So I just wanted to add that and underscore it.
And also in terms of working with like international journalists, I would say, especially coming from the West, you have to be very careful that you're not going to be extracting a story from a community, right? That it's really like, the way I approach collaborations is always, I have like so much privilege, like a certain amount of privilege, and I want to give you that privilege. Like I want to be able to facilitate you using my privilege to do whatever will help you. Right. So I think coming at it from a place of, I want to support you instead of I need this story from you. But also, when you write when you start talking about like the global South, there's a language barrier there that I think a lot of people don't always account for. So I always recommend, hiring like locally, like hire the people in the community to tell the stories, but also be very patient because English is not their first language. So from a very practical standpoint, like I've worked with journalists in other countries, and I've had to do like a lot of revisions on the English that was written because English is not their first language. So also be very be aware of that, but also like understand that you're going to get probably a deeper, more interesting, compelling story because you're working within instead of trying to like latch on and tell your own story. And also, I do want to also comment that something that's come up a lot is like, all of the like Western portrayals of trans folks are really what then gets disseminated into the rest of the world. And so I think it's very, very important to be very cautious about what we're sharing personally, knowing that like, whether it's the films that we're making, the articles that we're writing, like our things are really like the number one thing on Google, like you get me? So it's very important to be very critical about what's being shared. Mm-hmm.
Did anyone else want to speak to that, or can I ask the next question? Thank you. We have a question from Sam Sharf. They want to know, how do y'all envision expanding contemporary trans representation beyond a limited binary framework?
Unsure if I'm gonna answer your question correctly, or what you're expecting, but the thing that popped in my head, Oliver, as you mentioned earlier, like zines made by trans folks. And when I think about expanding, representation of us as a community beyond the tropes that we are used to seeing, beyond the binaries that we're used to seeing, I find that a lot of the work that is truly doing that is the work that's created outside of, the corporate institutionalized type, systems, which is not to say that those works are not important for what they do in the culture. But there are often, just limitations that come with, the studio system, right? Or the institutional corporatized system. And so the work that is being done in these, artistic communities and underground art spaces. And I'm thinking in this moment of Tuck Woodstock, who's a fabulous journalist, host of the Gender Reveal podcast. Him and Nico Stratus just edited a zine called Too Trans, Too Furious. And it's a collection of trans folks from a variety of identities opining and talking about their connections or lack of connections to the Fast and Furious franchise. And I think like the ability for us as trans folks to take this property, right, and project and inject ourselves into it, and also take, the piss out of it as well at the same time, I think is representative of the ways that we can begin to just like see ourselves in culture in different ways, beyond what we have been, told we should see ourselves as based on the images that we see.
I'm going to jump off of that and say that one thing that came up for me while you were talking, Tre'vell, was that the reality of that, like one of the reasons why there's so much pushback to having any queer representation that youth have access to is because when folks have that possibility, when they're able to see different possibilities and who they can be at a young age, that's going to push things so much further because they grow up in a world where they can be themselves, and then they can start imagining, okay, what does their future look like? What do the world they want to look like? And so to me, that's one of the just a terrifying thing that the right wing is doing right now is really taking away access to possibility from young people. Yeah, and so I think that the more that we have that, there was this. I'm so upset that I can't remember the name right now, but there's this wonderful cartoon movie that just came out about disinformation and trans. I'm gonna look it up in a second and let y'all know. But and it was just about how the stories that we're told, we have to question all of them, and it was just so beautiful. And I just want to see, I'm excited that there is more representation for young people, and I'm horrified that there's so much pushback to that.
I think that's a really important point, but both of you are making, of we need diversity of not only different kinds of stories, but the forms that those stories take, and also different genres. And when we see trans and non-binary and people who are beyond the expanse of gender and have different words and labels to use for themselves, that we are approaching them as people first with a complexity of identity rather than one identity as the center that everything is orbiting around. We've seen that a lot for good reason. I think anyone who's listening should check out what the Hays Code was to understand the history of how LGBTQ people generally have had to circumvent these rules around how they weren't able to appear explicitly on screen. And it is also to reinforce what both Tre'vell and Oliver Ash were saying, of that's why these pushbacks, these book bans, these basically censorship of stories have taken on such vigor, is because once you untube the toothpaste, it's not going back in. I often joke that the increase of LGBTQ identification is not because there's something in the water. It's because we've created a culture that is marginally more accepting for people to be who they are. And part of that is because we have been able to usher in more stories about us, so that the ones that many of us grew up with are not the dismal outlooks about what life will be or not be, because we are who we are. So we have to continue pushing back against those forces with our creativity, with those different stories that are centering the many things about us that make us who we are, and not just specific identities in the ways that the media has tried to for so long contain us within.
We are getting lots of beautiful questions, so I'm just going to usher us forward so we can get to as many of them as possible. We have one from Tati, who is a Colombian immigrant and graphic designer. They say, I know that the personal is political and owning a trans identity is in itself political, considering the current powers that be. Do you have any tips for moving intentionally in your personal life to advocate for other trans people, including family members, coworkers, friends, and acquaintances?
What comes to mind for me, particularly when the question asks about, how you can show up for trans folks who might be coworkers. I think the reality is that in many of our spaces, we at least believe there are no trans people there. And so I think oftentimes when folks are thinking about how they show up for trans people, they're, waiting on a, catalytic moment, which is usually, oh, we now have a trans person here who is saying that they need or require, these particular accommodations. How do we adjust then? When the reality is we should all be working to create, safer spaces around us, even when trans folks are not there, right? So that when we do come into those spaces, or when we do proclaim ourselves after having already been in those spaces, that the environment is already, appropriate for us. And so what does it look like as a non-trans person to, for example, go to your HR department and ask why gender affirming care isn't covered in the company insurance plan? What does it look like as a non-trans person to, go to your higher ups and ask why there are not gender neutral bathrooms, in your workplace? What does it look like to, you know, not allow a transphobic joke to happen in front of you, you know, at the water cooler? Do they still have water coolers in offices these days? Unsure. It's probably never mind. And so I think those are like small ways that folks can think about, you know, how to show up for people who may be already in the space, but also might not be in the space yet.
Yeah, I underscore everything as usual that Tre'vell says. And as I'm thinking about this, I'm also just, I guess, thinking more on like an ideological level. And I'm also thinking about, in terms of the last question too, I mean, I know we're grinding so hard to get the non-trans, the people who are not blessed to be trans to, or non-binary, to understand our existence. And I think in some ways we've moved into another kind of binary of trans and cis, or trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming and cis. And part of, I think, the task that's going to emerge for us imminently is getting cis folks to understand that they're actually gender non-conforming too. Like, actually, the default is to be gender non-conforming, because none of us will ever live up to these ideals of masculinity and femininity and womanhood and manhood. And so when I think about the advocating piece, another part of that is getting people to understand that we actually all need the same things as human beings, right? We all need healthcare. You know, we could call it all gender affirming care, honestly, because we're all dealing with some kind of gender shit, right? You know, so I know none of this is like a concrete kind of thing, but I think that's because there's an ideological shift that we're on the precipice of, that we've got to get cis folks to understand that we're actually not so different from you. We just own the fact that these gendered restrictions are bullshit. You just are living under this fallacy that it's working for you, and it's not.
That was some truth that was just dropped on all of us. And I think it's what excites me about this work, is that while I am the director of transgender representation at GLAAD, most of my job is educating people who have never thought about their gender that they also have one, that they are also impacted by anti-trans bills, by anti-drag bills, by by all the ways that specifically white Christian nationalist expectations of gender that is so rigid negatively impacts every way of people being able to be freely themselves. So everything that Raquel just said, I, again, double tap or whatever the thing is. And a big part of empowering people to be allies and accomplices in this work is to underscore how they are also impacted by the ways that, while people say this, well, this is to target trans people, well, it's a slippery slope, because there is no way to go around and identify the trans people who are living out in the community. Many of us are just existing alongside you, whether you know it or not, and it's going to impact you regardless. And so to sort of the way that we can understand liberation, none of us are free until we all are. Understand that this fight that you don't think is yours, whether you know it or not.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, so I'm going to ask this one from Andy. This person says, in my newsroom, I faced hostility personally and disdain for the incarcerated trans women I was reporting about. What tools can I share with my newsroom to combat their ignorance regarding transgender people? Can I kick off this by saying, look into the work of our 5 panelists and encourage your coworkers to listen to the TransLash podcasts, encourage folks to read Tre'vell and Raquel's books, encourage folks to watch Changing the Game and Disclosure, and to look into all of the amazing reporting and filmmaking that Kristal does.
Oh, go ahead, Raquel. I saw you. Go. Okay, I was just gonna say, I believe I know this, Andy. Hey, girl, how you doing? But I would say that my advice would be less about resources that you can share with them and more about your own spirit and commitment to the fight. And so I hope you remain undaunted, right, by the pushback and foolishness that you are dealing with. Because the reality is, right, when we are in newsrooms trying to, ensure that the coverage of trans folks is, accurate and nuanced and not a tool of manipulation, right? We are also combating not only just like these foundational things of journalism, but also the personal feelings and ideas of the editors, right? And the assignment folks, right? The copy desk. I can't tell you how many times I had to debate with a copy desk. Love copy editors, don't get me wrong, but baby, listen. And so, it's one of those things where I think the progress comes, after time, and we can't get tired, right? Because the way that the system and the status quo is maintained is by us getting tired. And so how do you go about remaining undaunted, protecting yourself and your energy in the process, but continuing to put this information in front of them, sharing opportunities and panels like this when they happen in the various other films and shows and documentaries and pieces that have already been mentioned. But, I think progress, particularly in a lot of news spaces, is going to be incumbent upon the allies, the accomplices, continuing to put themselves, unfortunately through the bullshit in order to wear these people down. We got to wear the ignorance down, y'all. It's I'll shut up now. Go ahead, Raquel.
No, everything you said, wear that ignorance down. Y'all quote that one. Another quotable from Tre'vell. I'm joining Tre'vell in, validating and honoring what you experienced, because that's the most important thing, as Tre'vell is saying. I mean, you're experiencing harm. And we need to be able to name that so we know what we're dealing with. That is harm. That is a violence, right? It's not the maybe capital V violence that we think about in society, but it is a violence. I think, I want to say HR, but we know HR often is more in cahoots with whoever is in power at an organization or company. So see if that's a viable option. I think this is a space where taking stock of the community around you is important. I mean, sometimes we can be blessed to have community within our workplaces. So are there allies there that maybe you can rally up and say, hey, I need support on this? I don't know what that support looks like. Maybe we can work through it together. It's a little bit of organizing and advocating for yourself. And I think finding community externally. When I dealt with anti-Blackness at Transgender Law Center, hey, I say it because it's in my memoir now. I sought out places where I could have those conversations and could develop those tools externally. And there, of course, were folks internally too. But that piece is important because often those folks can share notes with you about how to make it through. They may have leads on another workplace to go to. Because let's be clear, you don't owe these workplaces anything if they're harming you, especially. So this idea that we have to stay somewhere and endure, that's one of the gifts that the millennials we've given the workplace in some ways, is that we're like, nope, gotta go. This don't fit for me. I gotta go. And I know that that's not always easy. I know the job market is hard for us, especially as storytellers. But know that that is an option for you, and you deserve to take it and not feel any guilt or shame about it. So that's what's on my heart. I think the community piece is so key, having a place to vent and try and heal, and hopefully get those concrete tools that you need for this very specific experience of harm.
Yeah. I want to add from like a labor perspective that like usually where there is transphobia, there are other forms of discrimination. There's like racism, deep misogyny, you know, it's crazy. So I would document everything, every instance, have email screenshots, try and get as many things written as possible. Please protect yourself. Because most of the labor laws in this country are built to actually support the company. And so as a laborer, you are like pretty, you're disadvantaged coming, you know, just from that perspective. And I would say start talking to your coworkers as well. And talk to them about what they're experiencing, because I promise you, if you're feeling this, they are also feeling similar things. And labor organizing usually starts from talking to other people. Could be about the pay that you're receiving. It could be about, did you really get this break? Did you get, like if you worked overtime, did you really get paid for that overtime? So start from that kind of conversation. But if you're really going to consider unionizing, it's very difficult to unionize a workspace. It takes a lot of time. A lot of like even the contract negotiation could take a year, 2 years, depending on the company. So again,
there's been so much good advice on this. I want to say that you know, I know that the Trans Journalists Association does do some newsroom trainings, has a style guide. It's one resource. Whether or not that resource is going to you know, be welcome in your newsroom is another question. And you know, going to what Raquel said about community, you know, if you can't find people in your newsroom that you can have conversations with, getting support, having good boundaries with work, you know, unfortunately, you know, there's this myth, and for like a lot of workplaces are like, oh, we want you to bring your whole self to work. And the reality is that's not safe for everyone in every workplace. And so being able to have boundaries with your work. But yeah, I mean, if you have allies, if you have people you talk to who can be strategic, who can support you, whether that's within or outside your workplace, you know, other folks in your industry who are dealing with the same things in their newsrooms, because if you're in a really hostile newsroom, and you don't have there are so many other people in hostile newsrooms. And so, you know, finding people that you can get support from, who you can be strategic with you when you can, because like, you know, the reality is that like, yeah, you've got like, you can't burn yourself out, and like, that's not going to help anyone, and kind of, and can be hard. And so really making sure to take care of yourself. Yeah.
Just on a final note of someone that doesn't work in a newsroom but echoes everything everyone has shared, is that I wish I had known growing up that my value was not about how productive I was and how disruptive I was every single day. Like, lives are hopefully long. This work has to be sustainable. It is ongoing, it is enduring, and that's how we need to also look and care for ourselves.
That's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you. Thank you again, Alex, Kristal, Raquel, Raquel, sorry, my accent continued. Kristal, Raquel.
If I had
also
the accent,
to-
I'd do it too, honey. So I love it. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. And also thank you, deep, deep, deep gratitude to Richard and Ginger, without whom this would not have been possible. Richard is the president of the NLGJA in Los Angeles, and Ginger is the president of the NLGJA in Philadelphia. These are two of the exact folks that our panelists were speaking about. You can get in contact with to really build that community so that you know you're not alone. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you for hosting, and yeah.
Yes, thank you, Sophie.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there. So just make sure you take a screenshot of what we have on the screen up now, so you can reach out to our panelists and learn more about the LA and Philly chapter of NLGJA. And also check out the Critics Corner, the Rotten Tomatoes Critics Corner, for more resources available. So thank you all.